of the ditch until you figure out how you drove into it.
So Rob, in your book, you talk a lot about the difference between pleasure and happiness. Mm-hmm. In just a few sentences, can you tell us what is the major distinction between the two?
So from a social standpoint, pleasure is the feeling that this feels good, I want more. Mm-hmm. Happiness or contentment is the feeling of this feels good, I don't want or need anymore. They're not the same. In fact, pleasure begets more pleasure. This is what the casinos are counting on. On the other hand, I don't want or need anymore says, you know, what if there was something to purchase, I don't need to purchase it. In fact, all of the things that say this feels good, I don't want or need anymore, are things that you can't buy. They're not for sale. They are, however, accessible to every single human being on the planet. They're all the things your mother told you, but you forgot. I call them the 4 C's. First one, connect. So interpersonal connection turns out to be extraordinarily important for happiness. And the reason is because face-to-face, eye-to-eye connection generates something called empathy. Empathy activates a specific set of neurons in your brain which have been termed mirror neurons, so that the feelings of the person you're talking to ultimately become adopted by you as well. And in that process, you generate contentment. So interpersonal connection is extraordinarily important. This is one of the reasons why we have religion, is for that interpersonal connection. Turns out the faith is not important. The interpersonal connection is. But then you have to ask the question, well, what about non-interpersonal connection? Like, for instance, Facebook. Turns out Facebook actually sows unhappiness, in part because there's no interpersonal connection. There's no serotonin rise. There's a dopamine rise every time a message flashes across your screen. It's called variable reward, and it actually causes you to increase your actions to access more Facebook. And that actually drives further depression, and the data now show that this is a vicious cycle. Second one, contribute. And contributing means not to your bank book, means to outside of yourself. So you can do it within your work by making the work a better place for your colleagues, or you can do it outside of your work by volunteerism or philanthropy. So there are a lot of different ways to accomplish, contribute, but ultimately it has to be outside yourself. Third one, cope. So in order to reduce stress, thereby improving your serotonin receptors to allow for better feelings of happiness, there are 3 things. 1, sleep, something we're getting much less of, in part because of our screens. In fact, my colleague Christine Madsen at UC Berkeley showed that 8th graders who slept with their cell phone in their room got 28 minutes less sleep each night than those who charged their cell phones outside the room. A recent study showed that if the cell phone is sitting on the desk, even if it's off, it takes 3 times as long to accomplish the task as if the cell phone is not there. By being a distraction, and from the blue light emanating from the screen and actually activating that part of your brain that keeps you awake. Cell phones and other screens, which now have dominated our lives, have actually promoted unhappiness. Second thing within COPE, mindfulness. We know a lot about mindfulness. We study it along with other people at the Osher Center here at UCSF. In fact, multitasking is probably the single biggest destroyer of happiness that we have. People pride themselves on their being able to multitask. Companies look for the people who can multitask the best. Turns out only about 2.5% of the population can actually do two things at once. Everybody else, it's smoke and mirrors. And the more things you take on, the quicker you get unhappy and the lower your serotonin goes. And finally, within COPE, the last one is exercise. And it turns out exercise will tamp down dopamine and increase serotonin on its own. And when you use exercise as a mitigator of stress, you can clearly advance your serotonin in a very positive way. And then lastly, the fourth C, cook for yourself. When you go out to a fast food restaurant, you don't know what you're eating. And it turns out there are 3 items in your diet that matter in terms of the serotonin-dopamine connection. The first one, tryptophan. Tryptophan is the amino acid that is the building block to make serotonin. Happens to be the rarest amino acid in our diet. It's mostly found in fish and flax. We don't eat a lot of fish in general. It's probably low on our list, in part because of shipping processes, farmed fish versus wild fish, etc. But the bottom line is fish have a very high level of tryptophan. Omega-3 fatty acids, those are found also in fish, and they are found in certain foodstuffs that are grown, mostly algae. Things that eat algae ultimately increase your omega-3s. So fish eat algae, we eat the fish. Why are omega-3s important? Because they provide stability to neuronal membranes, so it's less likely that neurons will die. And they can be compressed easier. They allow for neurons to come back to shape so that you don't kill off the neurons that ultimately drive happiness. And then lastly, the negative one, fructose, sugar, the one that actually drives dopamine up, also drives serotonin down. So, high tryptophan, high omega-3 fatty acids, low fructose. That's called real food. When you cook for yourself, that's what you're making, that's what you're eating. And you're cooking for yourself and your family. You get the interpersonal connection, you get the contribution to something outside yourself. It's basically a win-win-win. On the other hand, fast food, you're eating alone, you're eating things you don't know what's in it, and you're eating a hell of a lot of sugar because every item at the fast food restaurant has been spiked with added sugar, specifically for their purposes, not for yours. So we have moved on to a fast food consumption society. And in the process, we have actually impeded our ability to get happy. And we have to understand these problems in order to unravel them.
A lot of the substances that you're talking about are everywhere. They're ubiquitous.
Indeed.
How do we become aware of our addictions to them?
Well, it can be hard. I can tell you. I know what I'm addicted to. Caffeine. My wife and I, 2 codependents with the Krupps. The fact is that a lot of people don't necessarily understand that they are addicted. They know they need something. When want becomes need, that's usually a sign of addiction. And I will tell you, I need my 2 cups of coffee in the morning just to function, and I'm not proud of it. On the other hand, if you take my Starbucks away from me, I will kill you. A lot of people say they have a sweet tooth. That's usually a sign of sugar addiction, if they say that. If they find themselves not being able to concentrate on their job or on their family because this craving is calling to them and it's interfering with their daily life in some fashion or in their work, that's usually a sign of addiction. And that can happen from shopping, from porn, from video games and cell phones. That, of course, has been the most recent addition to this. If you find yourself checking your cell phone every 2 minutes, waiting for a new email, that's usually a sign of cell phone addiction. And it works the same way in terms of the dopamine. There's a paradigm that companies use to get us addicted. It was outlined in a book by Nir Eyal called Hooked. It starts with a trigger, an itch, if you will, okay, and then that itch has to be scratched, and presumably the scratch is something that's socially acceptable, like, for instance, checking a cell phone, and then variable reward. Now, if the reward's the same every time, it won't become a habit. It won't become an addiction. But if it's different each time, then there's an impetus and a pressure to keep doing it and keep checking it, and ultimately it becomes part of your daily life. That is what cell phones have done over the last 10 years. They've basically occupied this primary position within our culture, to the point where we almost now can't even concentrate on our jobs. And the last part of the cycle is investment. That is, you have to be willing to plunk down another $299 for the next iPhone in order to keep the addiction going. And indeed, virtually everyone in America has opted for that addiction virtually over everything else. So this has been a slow but nonetheless steady drumbeat that has preoccupied America, and not just America, but the entire world. And it's one of the reasons why Apple and Samsung duke it out for market share, because basically it's about who's going to supply the rest of the world with their addiction.
So then, craving is a big component of it. Being willing to forego these components of happiness is another component, and then being willing to invest.
Well, not necessarily forego feelings of happiness. The problem is that you have to know what happiness is in order to be able to
foregoing the connection and the contribution and all of these things.
Right. So the question is, why is it that pleasure and happiness have become confused? Did industry start that? It actually started earlier than that. It started with the Declaration of Independence. Remember life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Well, turns out life is going in the wrong direction. We now know that average lifespan in the United States is going down for the first time. Liberty, turns out, depending on where you were born, that determines your final salary. If you were born in Palm Springs or in Los Angeles, you make more money than if you were born in Baltimore or Detroit for the exact same job. We've constructed ghettos of our own volition, whether they be inner city ghettos or, walled ghettos in fancy parts of town. They're still prisons. Gilded ones sometimes, but prisons nonetheless. And finally, happiness. Remember that clause, the pursuit of happiness? It was said twice. Once in the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, and then reappropriated by Thomas Jefferson for the Declaration of Independence.
One of the substances that you've written and talked about the most has been food, processed food, and of course how this contributes to metabolic disease. It seems like our healthcare system is set up, albeit not the best, to treat metabolic problems more than to prevent them. Is it hopeless? Where do you see this going?
Well, right now, we have more money going out for chronic metabolic disease than for everything else. In fact, 75% of our healthcare expenditures are for the diseases that constitute metabolic syndrome. That is, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, lipid problems, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and dementia. You add that up, that's 75% of expenditures. Here's the math. The food industry grosses $1.46 trillion a year, of which $657 billion is gross profit. They're making a huge profit. However, healthcare expenditures are $3.2 trillion, of which 75% is chronic metabolic disease, of which 75% of that could be prevented if we could fix the food problem. Bottom line, you can't have health care reform unless you have health reform. And you can't have health reform unless you have diet reform. Now, Obamacare promised that we could put 32 million sick people onto the rolls and that we would pay for it with preventative services. By being able to go to your doctor, you wouldn't have to use the emergency room, which costs 50 times as much. And that's how we would be able to pay for all these people. Turns out that with Obamacare, emergency room visits went up, not down. And costs went so high that 3 of the major insurers opted out. And that was one of the reasons for the election of 2016, focusing on health care. Here's the problem. Obamacare did not address diet, but neither does Trump care, and neither does the current Senate and House bills that are trying to repeal and replace. The bottom line is, until we address the problem of diet, which will also, of course, address the question of pleasure and happiness at the same time, we will not see an improvement in our healthcare system anytime soon. This has to be front and center. In addition, food is 20% of investment, but it is 40% of climate change. Agriculture contributes 40% of climate change. So if people are worried about this problem, as they should be, then fixing America's diet has to be front and center for the 2 biggest problems that we have today: climate change and health care. This is at the center of both of these phenomena, and we will not be able to solve it until we start to address it.
Can you tell us a little bit about what led you to write this book in the first place?
So I've known about the dopamine-serotonin connection for 30 years. I knew about this when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Rockefeller University, cutting up rat brains and studying how hormones affected neurons. But it wasn't until 2014, when I was giving psychiatry grand rounds at a major medical school here in the United States, and I talked to the outpatient coordinator of their recovery program, who herself was a reformed heroin addict. And she told me something that was so jarring. What she said to me was, she said, when I was shooting up, I was happy. What my new life has brought me is pleasure. And I thought to myself, wait a second, this is exactly opposite. When she was shooting up, that's what brought her pleasure, because it was heroin. And her new life has provided her with a more steady, long-term feeling of contentment. So I thought to myself, how often does this happen? And is this potentially at the bottom of why we have an opioid and an addiction crisis? And I've talked with many psychiatrists who have had the same experiences told to them by their patients. About a week and a half after I got back from that trip, I was talking to my sister-in-law, and she used to work the help desk at Pillsbury before they were taken over by General Mills. You know, like what people would call in, why they have icicles and they're popping fresh dough, and stuff, why the carton would, the microwave carton would melt, in the microwave, things like that. And she stayed friends with the people she worked with, and they had a gourmet club every year, and they would all bring things. And one of the members of her gourmet club said to my sister-in-law, "You always stay so nice and thin. How do you do it?" And this woman had just undergone bariatric surgery for obesity. And my sister-in-law said, "Well, really, I just only eat when I'm hungry." And the woman said to her, "Eating for hunger? Eating is for happiness." And I thought to myself, aha. I take care of obese kids for a living. And I've heard that story, but it was never so jarring as when I heard this this discussion, and I put the two together and I said, we don't know the difference. And indeed, there is an entire paper trail of not knowing the difference. And you can see it on television, on YouTube, virtually every day. Coca-Cola's Open Happiness campaign. Happy Hour. Okay. Cialis. Will you be ready? Add a little stress thrown in. Bottom line, we have mistaken the experience of pleasure for the experience of happiness. And so we continue to drive our interest in pleasure at the expense of our happiness. And you can't undo the paradigm unless you understand it. And the 4 C's are the way to fix the problem.
Thank you for talking with us today about your new book. You can buy Rob Lustig's new book, The Hacking of the American Mind, at Amazon.com or a bookstore near you.